And thank you all for coming, because I'm slightly surprised and flattered to see some of you, because this was originally really scheduled as part of the master's course, but we decided to open it up. But when we decided that, I thought really that was probably just a way of holding the lecture in this room. I didn't really expect many other people to come to it, so I'm flattered that you're here. I hope you won't feel you've wasted your time. I'm not actually going to really talk about my research as such, and I was thinking this afternoon, I think it's quite strange. I think this is the third in this series that I've given, and they're becoming progressively more general. So the first talk I gave was really very specific on, this was last year, on malarial immunology, and in fact it was really quite technical and specific. So I imagine that put off a lot of people coming to the next one, which was very broad, and it was about malaria policy. And this one is actually about an even broader subject, which is the issue of building research leadership and capacity. And you might wonder why I'm talking about Africa specifically, particularly as this was geared as part of a course which is not about Africa, it's about international health. And the reason I'm talking about Africa is really twofold. One is pretty obvious, that's where I work and that's where my experience is, and that's where I feel most able to talk about. But the other is because there are really some very pressing issues about research capacity in Africa which do distinguish it, I think, from much of the rest of the world. That's not to say that there aren't issues about building research in many parts of the world, but there are some very specific ones, as I'll illustrate about Africa. But a lot of what I say will in fact be equally applicable for those of you from other parts of the world. And I'm going to do a couple of things really. I'm going to try and give a broad overview of where we are now and the starting point and what the issues are. But I'm also going to tell you more specifically about a set of initiatives which I've been recently involved with, which is more, if you like, an update. And I think it's quite, I hope it'll be quite useful, particularly for those of you who work in or around Africa, to know about this, because I think it has some direct implications for the future. And then I'm going to sort of round up by taking a step back and taking a slightly broader overview of what I hope will be happening in the future. So, okay, who's this? Kwame Nkrumah, yeah, absolutely. So one of the great Pan-African thinkers. And he had a vision which was widely shared at the time when Africa became independent, of the role that science and technology would play in the development of Africa. I'm not going to read it to you, because I'm sure you can all read, but it's an inspiring vision, I think, and it was very widely shared. This was actually, he said this in a speech in 1963 at the inaugural meeting of the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, which has subsequently turned into the African Union. And it turned from the OAU to the AU once all the countries in Africa were independent, because the point of the OAU was to establish independence for all countries in Africa. And this was in the inaugural meeting in 1963 in Lagos. This is what Kwame Nkrumah said, and he presented a vision of the role that science and technology would play in the development of Africa. Now, as many of you will know, it hasn't quite worked out quite as he hoped it would do, or at least not yet. We hope that it will do eventually. And in fact, the history has been more checkered than that. It's not been as bad as was implied in this terrible issue of The Economist. I don't know how many people saw this when it came out, but there's a really dreadful issue of The Economist which called Africa the hopeless continent. And The Economist has since changed its mind, as illustrated in these sort of covers. First of all, Africa is rising, and now it's very hopeful. And this narrative of Africa rising is one which is very current, and I think is exciting, but it's also quite contentious. A lot of people are challenging the idea that Africa is rising. But I think I really wanted to just reflect the fact that views are changing and Africa is changing. But I don't think we should either be at the hopeless end of thinking about what's happening with science in Africa, but nor should we be too unrealistically optimistic. I think we should be optimistic, but we should be realistic when we say, well, what is the issue? Where are we starting from? And I think where we're starting from is kind of summarised here, which is that Africa contains around about 15% of the world's population. That proportion will grow larger over the next few years. Africa's growing much more quickly than other continents. It has a disproportionate degree of the disease burden, and I'm going to talk largely about health research, but it's not restricted to health research, but I'm going to use health research as a way of talking about research capacity. So a really disproportionate degree of the world's disease burden, a really disproportionate underrepresentation in terms of health workers, only 3% of the world's health workers and 2% of the economic resources. But something I hadn't really realised, despite the fact that I've spent most of my career working in research in Africa, was just how dire the situation is in relation to research. And if we believe, as I guess most of us do, that research is an essential part of developing an evidence base for health, then I was really surprised to realise just how under-researched Africa is in terms of sort of the proportion of the world's researchers. And even more worrying in a way, although for most of us in health this may not be a big issue, is that Africa only represents 0.1% of the world's patents. So what this means is that what such research that is taking place, and here I'm not talking about just health research, research which is taking place in Africa is contributing a minuscule amount to the global store of useful knowledge as reflected in patentable knowledge. And this really reflects something which I think we're all aware of, but which we need to grapple with and not accept. We often talk about one of the problems of African development being extractive industries. And when we talk about extractive industries, we tend to think of diamonds and gold and minerals and such like. But I'm sorry to say, and this is not meant as a criticism of any of us, except it's perhaps meant as a criticism of all of us, that research in Africa is largely an extractive industry. That is to say, research is carried out in Africa, is very often the value accrues, and the value accrues in terms of personal credibility, publications and such like, to individuals and institutions, and amongst those, of course, I can include many of us and institutions like Oxford. But it is true to say, and this is reflected in this kind of issue, the lack of translatable research. So much research in Africa is an extractive industry, and this is something which is not acceptable and which has to change. It's a rather complicated figure. It's not one that you need to look at in any detail. It's just the overall shape. This is actually taken from a recent... There's a very nice series for people who are interested at nature that's called Nature Indices, which looks at the sort of, if you like, the whole set of ways of looking at the way research works in the world. And it looks at collaborations and productivity of... it has to be said, rather high-end research. So these are sort of papers which tend to be published in Nature and similar journals. And what it's really showing is the world and the links between them. And just, it's one of these where you don't look in detail, you just screw your eyes up and get a general picture. So this is the United States. This is China and Australia. This is Europe. And this is the sort of, the further they are up and the bigger they are is an index of how influential and how collaborative their research is. And a really key thing about this is the recognition that collaborative research, internationally collaborative research, is always, in all areas, much higher value in terms of both the citation and actually the translatability than research which is not collaborative. And this is the thing which I think people often don't take on board. They often see collaborative research as sometimes a bit of a cop-out. Maybe it's a bad thing, but it's not. For everybody, for America, Europe, everywhere, collaborative research is always higher impact internationally than non-collaborative research. So this is the degree of collaboration, and this is like the outputs, and these are the links. And the whole point about this is kind of here's Africa, kind of struggling away on the outside, not part of this world system to any great degree. I just want to flag this to you. So I'm going to make use of a couple of figures from this, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But for those of you who are interested in the whole issue of where the world is at scientifically, and here it's the whole world, not Africa, this report has just come out. It's an enormous report. It's extraordinarily detailed, and it has fantastically useful information into it. Anybody who's got an interest in the broader sense of where science is, because this goes into a lot of detail about very specific things for every country and every region in terms of number of researchers, areas that are being researched on, but it also gives a much broader overview. So I highly recommend you can just download it online. It's a very big report. You'll need the weekend to read it. So taken from that is a figure which sort of makes clear in a way the point I was making about how under-researched Africa is in terms of the number of researchers in Africa. So shown here are the numbers of researchers per million population You can ignore the other axis, it's not especially important. This is the one that's important, the y-axis. It's the number of researchers per million population. There's Finland, over 7,000 per million. And I don't know if you can read these or not. That's Korea, that's Japan, that's the UK, Germany, so on and so forth. And it comes up, and there, finally, creeping on at the very bottom is South Africa. So look at the scale between, this is log orders disproportion, this is not just a small disproportion, between South Africa and the rest of the world, and say the top end, Finland, Denmark and such like. So there is a really massive deficit. So remember South Africa, because that was pretty poor there. But then this is the researchers per million in Africa. There's South Africa, kind of massively ahead of the rest of Africa. So now you can see why the other African countries just didn't appear on the world graph at all. So we're talking in many countries about 30, 40, 50 per million. These are 2 log orders less than the rest of the world. So if there is any merit in the argument that development in an important sense is driven by science and technology, then the fact that most African countries are 2 log orders less in the people who will produce that knowledge base is a really worrying thing for the future. So that's the depressing bit. So I'm going to move to the optimistic bit now. Africa is changing. All of us who live and work there will know that. Economic growth, and economic growth is not the only index, but it is an important index when you're starting from a low point, is high in most countries. On average, around about 5% across all of Africa. In some countries, it's considerably higher than that. And it has been maintained for several years. Africa is undergoing some really massive, and we've talked about this in the master's course, epidemiological changes. There's been an extraordinary reduction in childhood mortality over the last 10 years. There's a new commitment by governments to the role of science and technology in development. Now, often when we talk about this, we are, I think, justifiably skeptical, because governments often say they're going to do things, but they don't do them, and I'll show you on the next figure the degree to which people are or not doing it. But nonetheless, I think there is a real move in a whole set of declarations, the Abuja Declaration and other declarations of heads of state, that they will commit 1% of GDP towards research and development. And that's an important figure. Britain currently commits around about 2.2% of its GDP, and Britain is at the lower end of the OECD countries. Many OECD countries contribute a higher proportion of their GDP to research and development. But African leaders have set 1% of GDP as their target. Scientific output is in fact rising, and I'll show you that shortly. And this combination, of which in fact the economic growth is probably the most important, means that the next 20 years are going to be very different from the last 20 years. So when we look back and say we're starting from a low starting point, there's a lot of problems, a lot of issues, that's all true, but we should not base our view of the future on our view of the past, because they're going to be fundamentally different, and it's driven by economic development. This is a horrible figure, and so when everybody gives a talk and says, oh, this is too small, I always think, well, why did you show it then? And the reason I'm showing this is because I sort of got it this morning, and I didn't have time to change it into a good figure, which would sort of be very illustrative. So instead, I'm just going to ask your indulgence for me showing a really awful slide, and I'll tell you the points I want to make of it. And you can ignore all the columns. This is basically countries for which data are available in Africa. And this is the proportion of the of GDP which is invested in research and development. That's the column that counts. This one I'm going to just mention a couple of points about it. So, I said that African leaders have committed to spend 1% of GDP on research. This was the position actually in 2011. It's pretty much the same now. You can see that many countries are spending a very low proportion of that. But some countries have done pretty well. And in fact, perhaps surprisingly, given that it's one of the poorest countries in Africa, the only country which at that point had achieved the 1% was Malawi, which is really very surprising given its position. South Africa does pretty well. Where's South Africa? Was it about 0.7? Kenya doesn't do badly. 0.79. These have changed in the last couple of years a little bit. In fact, no one is now above 1%, but they're all, but the relative positions are about the same. So there's a big variation in what people are spending. And the only other thing I wanted to point out to you is, well, you probably can't read this, but these show the proportions that come from different sources, which include government and business and from abroad, so-called abroad. So this is investment from international funders. And it's just worth noting that there's some really big disparities. In some cases, 100% of funding comes from the government. In many, it's much less. But the amount coming from abroad also varies from almost nothing in some countries to really very large proportions in others. I was just interested looking at this. I'm not going to make any great point about this. The point I wanted to make was simply that most countries are way, way below what is the target. But a few countries, encouragingly, are getting towards it. And in fact, Kenya, I'm happy to say, although I'd be even happier if they did it, has put into law that they will spend 2% of their GDP on research and development. So that's now in Kenyan law. Those of us from Kenya know that that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen, but at least it's indicative of a direction of travel. Okay, perhaps surprisingly, given the sort of rather downbeat introduction that I gave, scientific output in Africa is rising. So this is North, Central and Southern Africa from 1999 to 2008, publications in all areas of science per year. And it was tottering along till round about 2004, then it really took off. Now you might say, oh, but that's because that's happening everywhere. The problem is there's far too many papers published anyway, most of them are rubbish. It's not a good index at all, just how much scientific output you're having. Well, it's not a great index, but it does provide some index. And it isn't the case that this is what's happening all over the world. Because if you look at, so again, 2005 to 2010, cumulative growth of scientific output. So if you were to put the UK on this, it would be pretty much a flat line. You can see some of the countries represented here, Australia, Spain, so on and so forth. But the countries which are really pushing ahead much faster than the rest of the world in terms of scientific output are India, China, and then this rather broad line because it amalgamates the three areas of Africa I talked about. So India, China, Brazil and Africa are shooting ahead in terms of the growth of scientific output compared with the rest of the world, which I think is both surprising and to some degree encouraging. But something which isn't very encouraging is the fact that collaboration between African Union member states in these publications is almost minimal. So during this period, only 4% of the total publications, remember I said earlier that collaboration is always of higher value than sort of non-collaboration. Only 4% of the output actually involves collaboration between African countries. That's not to say that there's no collaboration, but all the collaboration pretty much that there is for African research output is with northern countries. It's with Europe in particular because of colonial ties, but also with America. Now that's not a bad thing per se. In fact, it's a good thing, but it's not a good thing when it's so unbalanced and when the direction of drive for that research often is not coming from within the country itself. So international collaboration is good. That's not what I'm arguing against, but the imbalance is disproportionate and really has to be addressed. There is, however, building collaboration within Africa, and this is illustrated here, which again shows, if you like, it's one of these sort of networking type approaches which looks at joint publications. And you can see that when you look at collaborative research within Africa, it falls, as you might expect, into geographical clusters. Within West Africa, very little going on in Central Africa. But the real driver of African science is South Africa. I mean, and that's not surprising given what I showed you about the number of researchers. So South Africa really is very different in many ways from the rest of Africa in terms of the research base it has, the funding base it has, the quality of its research, and its influence on other research. I'm happy to say that Kenya is also coming up pretty strongly in that respect. So it isn't that there is no collaboration, it's that there isn't nearly enough collaboration within Africa. I don't know whether to say this is a hopeful sign or not. This is the proportion of women researchers in different African countries. Now, we often talk worldwide, the whole issue of gender balance in science is a major issue. I'm sure many of you follow this in different disciplines, it varies. But in general, there is a major issue of, well, for many parts of the world, there was a major issue of gender representation in science. Now, in some parts of the world, it isn't so much representation, it's career progression which has become the issue. But for much of, that's to say that now many parts of the world there are roughly equal proportions in many sciences of males and females, but progression is still very weighted very much towards males. But within Africa, as you might not be surprised, actual representation of women in science is relatively low in many countries. So, but on the other hand, it's coming up to almost parity in a number of countries, which I think is hopefully encouraging. Again, I always look for where Kenya is on these things. So I was surprised to find it's only 25%. But this was because it represents all science. And looking at the room now, and looking at the sort of Kenyans in the room, I realised that the proportion is really quite different, and that's our experience in our research programme, where we have actually a higher proportion of women in the health research programme we're involved in. But this is, I think, so I see this as a kind of glass half full sort of figure. There's an enormous way to go for many countries, but it is moving in the right direction. Another, I think, hopeful sign is, just out of interest, some of you have heard this talk before anyway, so you'll know this, but those of you who haven't heard the talk before, how many people have actually seen this document or even know anything about it? It's really interesting, isn't it? Sort of all the African researchers in the room. I'm not surprised. This is the African Union Science, Technology and Innovation Strategy for Africa, so-called STISA. And this is part of a much larger and incredibly ambitious vision of Africa, which actually extends to 2063. And people often say, why does it extend to 2063? And that's because it's 100 years from 1963, which was the foundation of the OAU. So this vision of Africa, which has been adopted by all African nations, and then within each nation has its own forward plan, usually over the next 30 years. Many countries have 25 years. Many countries have a Vision 2030. Kenya does. Is an all-embracing plan for the development of Africa. But within that, science, technology, innovation has really been given a major role in that forward vision. So I think all that's great. And this is reflected actually in many other Pan-African organisations. So for instance, the African Development Bank, which used to concentrate almost entirely on infrastructural development, now also places science, technology, innovation as foremost in its strategy for development. So all that's great. What's not so great is that nobody knows about it. Now, I'm actually not surprised that we don't know about it. What really does surprise me is whenever I talk to funders, they don't know about it either. And I find this really extraordinary, that those people charged with funding and therefore driving the agenda for research in Africa are totally unaware that there is a strategy agreed for every African country for what its research strategy in general terms is. So there seems to be both an enormous disconnect and a certain worrying arrogance, I think, that's happening without any reference. And it doesn't matter how good or bad this is, it's actually quite a useful document. I mean, it's not the best read you've ever read, but it's quite a useful document. But it's almost unreferred to, and yet it's supposed to lay out the strategy. However, I think the very fact that it exists is really important, because it's really making concrete that idea of science having a central role in the development of Africa. Okay, so that's general background. I've tried to give a sort of an overview of, I hope a realistic overview of where we're starting from. Lots of issues, but not totally depressing. Lots of optimistic signs as well, but a long way to go. I'm now going to talk about a particular initiative that I've been involved with over the last 18 months. And this involves, firstly, the African Academy of Sciences, where I'm based. Where I'm based half of my time, although people in Oxford might be forgiven for thinking it's somewhat more than half of my time, because I don't spend that much time in Oxford. So the African Academy of Sciences is a Pan-African organisation. It recognises scientific merit or excellence, and that's what it's largely done over the last 30 years. But it also provides a think tank function and a programmatic function. And it's the programmatic function that I've become very involved with colleagues in the Academy in developing over the last 18 months. So that's the Academy. The other element in this that we're partnered with is NEPAD, and many of you will know that NEPAD is essentially the technical arm of the African Union. And this relationship is very key for reasons I'll explain later. And again, those of you from within Africa, I'd be interested to know what your views of NEPAD is. Most people's views of NEPAD is not very flattering. Most people regard it as a sort of bureaucratic, inefficient, sort of largely redundant organisation. All this is possibly true, but it's actually incredibly important for reasons I'll sort of try and explain in a minute. So the idea of what we're engaged in, it gives the title to this talk, which is about moving the centre of gravity of research to Africa. And the fundamental idea of what we're doing is trying to develop a highly professional platform from which to develop both strategy for science development in Africa and also to work with major stakeholders, in particularly major funders, to actually develop and manage new initiatives. Now, this probably all sounds a bit kind of tedious and administrative, but I think it's actually incredibly important. When you think about it, it's crazy that sort of 50 years after independence, practically all the international scientific work produced in Africa is funded from, and therefore the direction is in an important sense set by, organisations completely outside Africa. I mean, it is crazy when you think about it, that even though, and this is not a criticism of these organisations, we're very dependent on them and we're very grateful for their funding, but it is a bit mad for those of us who are funded by the Wellcome Trust that sort of someone sat in Euston Road in London deciding what's going to happen for research in Africa, or sat in Seattle in the Gates Foundation, or sat in USAID or wherever. And there is no equivalent, with the exception of South Africa, which does have an MRC and does fund its own research. There is no equivalent anywhere in Africa for locating that strategic thinking and the management of research. So the idea of what I'm talking about here, is that moving the centre of gravity, is to establish that key aspect of strategizing and then funding scientific initiatives actually to Africa. And the concept is a very simple one. And this is that the Academy is partnered with NEPAD and also partnered with funding partners. And in the first instance, the funding partners I'm talking about are actually the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation and DFID. But the idea is that eventually this will be many funding partners, and now already it is a whole range of other funding partners. And they will establish, we will, in fact have established AESA. Now AESA, this is one of those kind of slightly crazy things. Firstly, it should have a double A, but it doesn't because it was too cumbersome. It actually stands for the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa, and it's a real mouthful. And people often ask why we call it AESA, and the honest answer is it's a kind of typographical error or hangover. In a concept document I wrote for the Wellcome Trust about 18 months ago, we had to write something, and thought, I don't know, Alliance for sort of blah blah. And just wrote it down, and it's stuck. We can't get rid of it. Even though it's hard to say, no one wants to get rid of it. I actually think it's because AESA sounds like Aisha, and Aisha is a popular record, and that's the only explanation that I could. That's the only explanation I could think of why it should lodge when it's so hard to say. But anyway, so it's called AESA. So AESA is the platform for managing science, and the idea is that it will have a whole set of initiatives doing different things in science in Africa with a whole set of different funders. So it's a very simple concept. This one is not one in which you're supposed to read all the things at all. It's to illustrate the timeline. We began thinking about this at the beginning of 2014, and I think the thing that we were really very happy about and was that we actually moved very quickly with it. It doesn't matter what all the elements are. The point was, by beginning of 2015, we'd both established the funding for this, redrawn up all the terms of reference, restructured the Academy, and appointed the AESA team and a director. And perhaps the most important thing, and this is where the importance of NEPAD comes in that I mentioned, in January 2015, through NEPAD, we managed to table the concept of AESA to the heads of states meeting in Addis. So all African heads of state endorsed AESA as the official platform for promoting science in Africa going forward. So I know this sounds as if one's being a bit, patting your own back too much, but I think it's an extraordinary achievement that we did this within a year of concept, because this usually takes about 20 years. And the reason it's really important is because it then enables us to walk into any Minister of Science and Technology or Minister of Health office anywhere in Africa and say, well, as your head of state has agreed, and it allows you to have that conversation. And without that, it's very, very difficult to move anything in most countries. So actually, that's why I was saying that whatever your views of NEPAD, my views of it have changed completely. And I've learned more about the politics of science in the last year than I learned about doing science in 30 years. And it's really, I now understand why it's so critical to work with institutions, even if you don't think they're brilliant institutions. So we launched AESA in September this year in Nairobi. This is Amina Greg Fakim, the president of Mauritius, who's also a fellow of the Academy. Fantastic sort of standard bearer for science in Africa. She's a very eminent scientist. She's she works on, I suppose, what you call pharmacognosy, or at least she's an entrepreneur as well. I mean, she works basically on extracting potential therapies from indigenous plants. That's her main interest. But she's now the president of Mauritius, which is very fortuitous, because it means that you have a head of state who is prepared to work with all other heads of states to promote science, and that's what she is doing. We also launched a whole set of initiatives, one called Deltas, we're launching a Grand Challenges Africa in partnership with Gates and others, and then an initiative for good financial practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Deltas initiative now, because this is the most developed. So the Deltas initiative is trying to put into practice what I've been talking about the idea of how you develop science and scientific leadership. And this was developing excellence in leadership training in science, that's Deltas. This was developed with the Wellcome Trust. They asked me to help them rewrite their strategy last year, and we developed this. And it was always envisaged that this would not be a Wellcome Trust initiative, but one which would make real that idea of moving the centre of gravity, which again is really quite an extraordinary thing for the Wellcome Trust to have done, because the total funding now for this amounts to around about $100 million, of which most comes from the Wellcome Trust, a little bit comes from different. So for the Wellcome Trust to put about $80 or $90 million of its money and say, yeah, that's fine, just move it to an African institution, was not a straightforward thing. I mean, it's a lot of money. But slightly surprisingly, they agreed to the concept. And so this is the first large program that we're running from the Academy, which I hope will form a model for the kind of things that we'll do in other areas of science over the next few years. So the key elements in this, and there's no rocket science here, and there's nothing that will, I think, surprise any of you, except perhaps I'll stress a couple of points about it. And this would apply to developing science absolutely anywhere. So now, I said at the beginning I was going to talk about Africa, but this would apply to all of us everywhere. And it's really based on the recognition that there are certain key things to make science work. And I've listed them here. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them you'll say are pretty obvious. I want to mention a couple of them, though, because this isn't always so obvious. The first is, in our view at least, that the development has to be science-led. Now, the reason I say that is because it's very common in so-called capacity development thinking to talk about training, developing PhDs and this sort of thing, as if the production of those things per se will drive science. But it won't. It's the other way around. You have to be doing good science to do good PhDs, not the other way around. And so, but this isn't reflected in a lot of programs for developing science. I think the fact that it's science-led or research-led is really important. As is the issue of creating environments with critical mass and a strong research culture. I think, again, one of the things that in their eagerness to sort of do good things, which is good, that many funders or institutions or even individuals, perhaps we've all been involved with this to some degree, often feel that the the capacity building side of something is, well, we're going to train a few people, you know, it's great, every bit counts. Well, it does. But the truth is that no good science, and certainly scientific leadership, can come out of something which doesn't have a critical mass. And by critical mass, I mean not simply people, but a critical mass in terms of both infrastructure, the managerial capacity to run science. But more important than that is something which is hard to define, which is the production of a scientific culture. And if you think about it, if you look at the CVs of sort of world leaders in science, anywhere in the world, you'll find that there's an enormous weighting towards people having trained in excellent groups, in whatever field you're in. So if you're in chemistry or whatever, Nobel Prize winners will usually have trained in the lab of one of the best groups in the world at that time, and so on and so forth. And you cannot overemphasize, no, this doesn't mean that we all have to train in the Nobel Prize winner's lab, but what it does mean is that when you're thinking about where you're going to do your training, always do it in centres of excellence. Always do it surrounded by really smart people, because it's that interaction between really smart people which drives ideas. It isn't having a PhD, it isn't being in a place with good equipment but not very many people. It's always being in an environment which drives that intellectual curiosity. And so I think this issue, and this is what Deltas is about really, is about building environments. Obviously mentorship is key and so on and so forth. The only other thing I want to stress here is continuity. This is in some ways self-evident, but in other ways often forgotten. Naturally, when people fund any effort in building anything, they're unlikely to fund for more than 3 to 5 years. But there is no point in even thinking about a science capacity development program in less than 20-year timelines. And I think the reason's obvious. This is research careers anywhere in the world, schematized, I mean it varies. But basically the idea is that from the point where some smart graduate comes into science full of sort of ambition for changing the world, to the point where they are holding a senior enough position to be able to influence the course of their field, whether they're running a large research group or running an institution or whatever, you're really talking about 15 to 20 years. That's how long it really takes. And unless the timeline for developing any program of capacity development is visualized in that way, it's just going to be pouring money in with no end in sight. So the whole Delta's conception is a 20-year program. That's not to say that the Wellcome Trust or anybody else has agreed to fund it for 20 years, but they all know that it's a 20-year program, not a 5-year program. Okay, I'm not sure whether to show these. I know, I'll show these next few slides. Many of you have seen them before. I feel it's almost too self-indulgent, but I hope you'll believe me when I say I'm not showing them to be self-indulgent. I'm showing them really to try and make concrete that idea that you can actually, over 20 years or so, build something, and it does take that long time. So this is just I'm going to show a few slides which reflect several of us in the room's experience over the last 20 years in a particular program in Kenya, one that 7 of us in the room have been involved with. Just to show that actually, over a 20-year timeline, things can change enormously, but you do have to invest heavily for 20 years. So that was the Kilifi Research Unit in 1989. That was it a few years later as we began to build things. And this is it today, an international research unit in Africa with fantastic facilities, fantastic staff, and a large number of African researchers building international groups. So that was just to make the point that it's not a sort of fantasy that over a 20-year timeline you can actually make massive differences, but you do need that time. That won't happen in 5 years. So just to summarize Deltas, which I think stands for our general approach and will apply to in other areas other than health research. It's about science quality and it's about research training, but it's also about building leadership and citizenship, which is a rather broader concept, and about building research management, which we often underemphasize. And yet all of us who work in African institutions know that one of the biggest issues is the management of the research, the facilitation of flows of funds and such like. And the overall vision is to develop a new generation of researchers who will play a major role in driving the research agenda in Africa in health for the next 50 years. Now, it would have been easy to sort of end on that slide, and then everyone would have said, that's great, so it's a great effort, well done everybody, it's fantastic. We are happy with the way it's going. But I think it's really important that we don't sort of get our vision too small. When we talk about bringing in $100 million, that sounds great, but in fact we don't need millions of dollars. We need billions of dollars. And as soon as you start talking about billions or hundreds of billions, people's eyes glaze over and they sort of say, well, it's fantasy, that will never happen. But it will happen, and it's really easy for it to happen. So if Africa wanted to achieve even the world average for researchers, not the sort of Finland, UK sort of level, just a world average, it wouldn't have to train a few, thousands or tens of thousands of PhDs. It needs to train 1 million, and it really ideally needs to train them in the next 20 years. That's a massive undertaking if you think about it, 1 million in 20 years. But that's what it would need. And to do that, I think that would probably cost between $1.2 billion a year and $2 billion a year. Where would that money come from? Well, there are potential for large input internationally. The G8 some years ago promised to put $3 billion in, not very much, but they promised to put it in. They haven't done yet, so we're going to be asking them what happened to that. I don't expect we'll get anything, but we're going to ask them. But I think the key point is that this money will come from within Africa. If countries can get up to their 1% GDP commitment, which several countries already have done, Africa's GDP is currently $2.4 trillion. So 1% of that would already generate enormous amounts of money. By 2050, who knows how accurate these predictions are, but the best economic prediction is Africa's GDP will be 29 trillion. That means that even if countries only get up to 1%, and remember some countries are promising to go beyond that, there'll be $290 billion a year coming into research and development in Africa. And that's what I meant when I said we shouldn't think the next 20 years are going to be the last 20 years. And we shouldn't be satisfied with the idea of programs which bring in a few $100 million. We have to have the perspective that it will actually take billions of dollars, but it's not an unrealistic assumption. This will happen, and it'll be funded largely from money within Africa, not from international funding, although international funding will remain extremely important. So, I want to finish there and to leave time for some discussion, but I want to really recognise the fantastic team at the Academy of Sciences that I work with. So thank you very much.